Good. Good morning. I'm Steve Koonin. I'm the Edward Teller Senior Fellow here at Hoover, and I am the convener of this session on energy transitions. I'm pleased to be joined by two of the world's leading thinkers on energy, Samantha Gross and Scott Tinker. You can find the bios in the program. I'm not going to go through them now, just to say that Samantha and Scott are among the people I turn to when I've got a crazy idea or need to be corrected.
She must see you a lot.
We're going to talk about the energy transition. None of us have a primary expertise in policy. Rather, we are, as Samantha likes to say, energy geeks. Scott as a geologist, Samantha as a chemical engineer, and I as a physicist. But we all three have a passion for informing policy, and that's particularly important in energy, where there are certain techno-economic, behavioral, geopolitical realities that have to be respected if you're going to do effective policy. And if you listen to the politicians, the media, watch the governments in the US, in Europe, you realize that there's a lot of educating that needs to be done about those realities. So I think we'll spend a lot of our time painting a picture of the energy landscape and energy transitions, and only toward the end start to turn explicitly toward some policy in our discussion. So let me start off. Samantha, the topic is energy transitions. What do we mean by that, and why should one even think about making a transition?
It's a great question, and I think most people out in the world think of it as one thing. They think of it as switching to renewables to deal with climate change. I define an energy transition a lot more broadly. I would like to see a transition towards an energy system that is better for people. And that means a few different things than just using more renewables to save Mother Earth. It means you need to make sure that all three aspects we talk about, I hate the term energy trilemma because I think it makes it sound like everything's bad. But I lost that battle. I think of it more as a three-legged stool. You need to balance affordability, security, and sustainability. And you need to keep those things in balance for people. And so I think of an energy system that is more balanced on those three attributes. And I think about one that provides people the energy services that they need while being good for both them and the planet. That is sometimes fossil fuels, particularly in the developing world. But there are reasons to move away from fossil fuels over time that don't have anything to do with the climate, with criteria pollutants, like the things that you were talking about, things like particulates or mercury or ozone, ground level ozone, things like that. So there are reasons to move away from fossil fuels that aren't about climate. I also care about the climate. Steve and I have some differences in areas, but I think the science is difficult, but I do think the science is directionally pretty clear, and I think that's something we should worry about, and we can get into how far we should go about for the whole rest of the panel. But that's where I want to start anyway, with what an energy transition means to me. It's about people.
Scott, you've been around the world a lot, looking at energy in many different contexts. Samantha introduced the idea of this, I like energy trilemma, but three-legged stool, three dimensions. How do you see those different dimensions getting weighted in different parts of the world?
Yeah, it's good. Maybe I'll start with this thought that, transitions happen when something better comes along. And in energy, we look at that. I'll give you an example. I drive a 73 Volkswagen Super Beetle. We bought it new when I was in high school, and I learned to drive on it. And I taught my wife how to drive on it. She wasn't my wife then. Still have it, and it's awesome. It's loud, and it's bumpy, and it's slow, and it's hot, and it's awesome. 70 horsepower in the back, air-cooled, And we also have now a Ford 250 diesel, and it's an incredible vehicle too. It'll haul our dogs, and it has maps that tell me what to do inside, and exhaust braking, and it's just completely different. Arguably, the 250 diesel is a little better vehicle than the 73 Super Beetle if you're really looking for all the things that cars do now. Same with phones. The one in my pocket is different than the curly-Q one I used to talk to her on with a cord, one in the house and hide in the closet, you know. So it's a better fit, it's a better system. So when we transition, the first form of energy was the sun. It grew the hay that our vehicles ate to walk around with and pull stuff. And it moved from dung and coal or wood and stuff, all sorts of carbon-based fuels. This is thousands of years ago. It wasn't until 1804 that the first coal-fired steam engine train in Wales commercialized. 1804. And that launched the coal, oil, and gas era, the hydrocarbon era for the last couple hundred years. They're better. Why are they better? Well, you get more bang for the buck. Yeah. Energy per unit weight, energy per unit area, per unit volume, however you like to measure it, it's just better. They're denser forms of energy. I just get a lot more useful work done with coal and then oil, which is denser, and natural gas, which is denser still per unit weight than oil. You just get more work done. And that's allowed civilization to do what's done. So they're better. So what are we going to transition into? It needs to be something better. That's hard to find. Uranium and thorium arguably are better for electricity generation. They're denser. I could take a uranium pellet that you stuff a fuel rod with in a nuclear reactor. It's about a centimeter tall, one little pellet. There's enough energy in that pellet to drive my car from New York City to here and back to Dallas. One pellet. That's dense energy. It's better, okay? Has downsides too. So transitions, we're not transitioning from less dense energy to less dense energy. It has to be better. And so it needs to be more affordable and it needs to be more reliable. That's better energy. Affordable and reliable. That's what drives economics. That's the physics. That's what drives the system forward. Affordable and reliable. And it was said this morning, I agree strongly, that back to the three-legged, energy underpins economies. We just talked about this. I met in North Dakota 15 years ago. Energy underpins economies. Economies invest in the environment. The best environments in the world are where there are healthy economies. The cleanest air, the cleanest water, the cleanest soils. We clean it up because we can afford to. The worst environments in the world, and I've been to over 60 countries, is where it's poor. You just can't. They have other priorities. They can't afford to clean things up. So you want to accelerate environmental protection and stewardship and emissions reductions, make people wealthy.
So I think, the clean leg of the stool has a secondary status relative to affordable and reliable. If you don't have energy, you're nowhere. As you said, emissions will reduce as people get richer. We should unpack, clean in terms of local pollution, for which I learned the new word Koonin arguments in the last session, seem to apply, versus the greenhouse gas issue, which is really a global problem and is not really, I think, amenable to local action. Does that sound right, Samantha?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think we were talking just in the back while we were getting mic'd up about some places where the Koonin arguments start to fall apart. And I think when you're talking about a global public good, which is what greenhouse gas emissions are, that argument does start to fall apart. You hear climate change described as a wicked problem, and one of the reasons why it is so challenging to deal with. Or also, if you want to look at a more optimistic side, has some easier ways to fix is that a molecule of CO2 emitted anywhere is the same as one emitted anywhere. It is not a local pollutant. It's fine locally. The problem is if you emit too much of it globally. And so I think what that allows us to do, getting into some of the things that Scott's describing, is to reduce emissions where you can most afford it. Because when we talk about climate change a lot, I think we get really wrapped up around the axle about, everybody has to cut down and we have to make 1.5 degrees and whatever. But the truth of the matter is, if we try to solve climate change and we do not deal with energy poverty, and we don't deal with the several billion people in the world who don't have reliable, useful, or well below the level of energy that would maximize their welfare, that's not a solution. That's garbage. That's not, that's environmentalism for rich people. That's not environmentalism for everybody. And so it is a much more difficult public policy problem than sort of a Koonin argument where, people in a specific area can decide how much pollution they're willing to live with and what they pay for it.
So let's talk about how it's going, this energy transition. If you look at the global numbers, fossil fuel use is surging. Coal is at a record high. I think oil's at a record high or close to it. Gas, the same. But at the same time, renewables are being deployed at unprecedented rates. But you also see that mandates, to use one of the words in the title of this conference, are being relaxed. Heating mandates, for example, in the UK and Germany turned into follies, actually, when the political system pushed back. So are we getting there fast enough? Do we need to get there fast enough? Scott, what do you think?
Well, depends on what your objective function is.
Yeah. Good.
And if it's carbon all day, 30 COPs, Conference of the Parties, have had zero impact on the trend of global emissions. Zero.
Those are the UN meetings.
Those are the big UN confabs where everybody gets together and talks about carbon and climate. It doesn't mean that they're not important. They just haven't had an impact on the actual emissions of those. So fast enough for what? If your objective function is human flourishing, as I think Samantha and I agree, and that's a passion of mine, made a film about it, we've got a nonprofit targeting it, et cetera, for the reasons we just talked about. Well, there's progress being made, but it's very slow. So if you look at all the world's countries, it's very interesting. There's a very strong correlation between energy consumption and GDP, energy per capita and GDP per capita. Okay, very strong correlation. The more energy you consume, the more wealth. It's not perfect, but it's a really nice correlation. R squared probably pretty high. It turns out conveniently the average of the rich world, which is only about 1.3 billion of us, the developed world, is 50 megawatt hours and $50,000. That's the average per capita energy and wealth, 50-50. As you go down from, and the US is higher than that, by the way, but that's the average of the wealthy world. As you go down there, there's 7 billion other people, as Samantha answered, living in some state below that, from a tenth of that or lower to up to that. And those 7 billion people are living in energy insecurity. Energy is not affordable to them. It's not reliable to them. They don't have the wealth, and they don't have any of the other things that we take for granted. Any of them. Education, health through refrigeration, just food security, water security, as talked about. None of that. So I think the objective function for a transition has to be to stop the growing disparity between these people that are stuck and us who continue to gain wealth and consume more energy. If you continue to grow that economic disparity, it doesn't end well. Think about the world. Whenever that's happened in the world, how does it end? And so that's not a solution for any of us. We have to unpin that, and as has been mentioned, that's done with access to affordable, reliable energy. And that's really the transition. Once that begins to happen better, and it's slowly happening, but not nearly at the pace that it could happen or in fact should happen. It's not an energy limit. There are a lot of other things keeping it there, but one of which is colonialism still.
So if I listen to the politicians in Germany, the UK, EU more generally, and here in the US, at least in the last administration, existential threat, the world is going to fall apart if we get above 1.5 degrees, doesn't sound right to me.
Yeah,
Samantha.
I'm happy to say a couple of words of that and also respond to a couple of things that Scott said. It is really unfortunate that people have gotten the impression 1.5 to stay alive is an expression that I find really offensive. The world doesn't automatically fall apart at 1.5 degrees. It just doesn't. Probably doesn't fall apart at 2 degrees either. And truthfully, according to the book that Steve wrote, it is very difficult to know when things get ugly. In my opinion, that doesn't mean that we should just emit great guns because we don't know when things start to get bad. That's a bad idea. But what has happened is the idea has been sold that the world sort of falls apart at these very conveniently round numbered terms of degrees. And that's problematic. And in that vein, I want to talk about something Scott said. He talks about, 50 megawatts and $50,000. When you start to get up into wealthy people like the people in this room, the GDP to energy use starts to fall apart and flatten a bit. You're actually seeing that decoupling between GDP growth and energy use and greenhouse gas emissions in really wealthy economies, like ours, like Europe, and a few others. And so it is possible to have economic growth without energy growth, but it's something you actually have to be rich enough to buy in many ways. And we're at the point where we're rich enough to buy that.
We have outsourced our energy use.
We have outsourced our manufacturing, and that is problematic. But it is also true that there are things that can be done, and the wealthy countries are leading in those things. Where I start to get into the problematic immorality about it that Scott is talking about is when you see things like the development banks or the Europeans or others. There are a lot of guilty parties in this. Who are looking at sub-Saharan Africa and going, you can't build any fossil fuels. Excuse me? It is impossible to develop a country's economy, industrial economy, the kinds that brings wealth and jobs, on solar panels. We're not ready for that. There are a lot of causes that played into the blackout that we saw in Iberia and Spain and Portugal a couple of weeks ago. But one of them is likely some of the grid effects of having a ton of solar holding up your grid at that particular moment in time. And so we need to work on our own energy consumption while making space for these guys to emit because they need to develop. And if we tell them not to, it's immoral, in my point of view.
All right, Scott.
Yeah, so look, I've installed solar in indigenous villages in Gunchukwa, Colombia, the Arhuaco people. We filmed it. You can go look at it in our film over 8 days and a year to visit ahead of that to get baptized in order to be invited to come back and do it and give them. That's all they could have. I mean, there are no roads that get you there. There's no power lines. There's no pipelines. That's first electricity. 3.5 kilowatt array, half of what you put on one home here. But it was mud huts with light bulbs and some ceiling fans and a community center and one fridge.
It's a big deal.
That's a good start. They asked for that, and that helped in the school too. But that's light bulbs and mud huts. We would call that a brownout. I mean, it's not electrified. It's light bulbs and mud huts. So it's a start. This is, I think, the big kind of challenge we face. And it's been hinted at here, rightfully, there's only one atmosphere in the world. So when we come to climate, if our policies, we can talk later, but if what they are doing is having us export the problem. Essentially, the non-OECD nations make all our crap, and the OECD nations bring it over here. One item at a time on an Amazon truck. How many got an Amazon delivery in the last week? Put your hands up. Come on, be honest. Okay, just one a day, one toothbrush. Oh, cool! I got a toothbrush from a truck. Where'd it come from? This is a shell game. That's all this is. California isn't green. You're playing a big shell game. You're importing more and more of your energy, more and more of your products, exporting more and more of your emissions to other people and saying your per capita emissions are lower. That's a shell game. That's not helping the climate because the folks that are making that stuff are not doing it as well or regulated as California does.
So let's take up this issue of international flow of goods. China has taken deliberate steps to corner the market on a number of things important to the energy transition. Solar panels, increasingly batteries for all sorts of applications, and the processing of rare earths, which are critical to many of the clean technologies. Should we be doing the same? Should we be getting into industrial policy to make sure that some of those activities occur at home or in friendly nations at least?
That is a darn good question. I'm not an economist, I know just enough to be dangerous. But I will say that the U.S. has really shied away from, until very recently, shied away from industrial policy, and for good reason. We believe markets work. I think everybody in this room believes markets work. It's the whole point. But it is very hard when you're dealing with a country like China that is really subsidizing, making really long-term plays that are difficult for U.S. companies to do with the backing of the government. If we don't do something about that, I think we're largely bringing knives to a gunfight. And that puts us in a really difficult situation because we're free market people, and I mean, our country believes that to the core. And so it's really hard for us, and so we're trying to figure out how to act in that environment. But it is true that China set up a government policy that we want to own the future, and we did not. And we're seeing that come home to roost right now, and you're seeing the political argument that a transition towards greener, cleaner, more renewable energy involves trading good old American fossil fuels for Chinese goods and raw materials. I don't think that's necessarily where we want to be, but we also, to Scott's point, have to think that some of these, mining and refining, are not necessarily things that everybody wants in their yard. They're dirty, kind of yucky industries that the U.S. sort of got out of many years ago for some of the reasons you described. We said, we don't want that here, we want somebody else to do it. And now some of that is coming home. And so you're seeing us making minerals extraction deals with some countries. I don't think much is going to come of the Ukraine deal anytime soon, but there it is. But we still haven't, and you don't hear enough talk about what to do about the refining side. Even if we were to build mines tomorrow in Ukraine, let's say, you'd still be selling many of those minerals into the Chinese monopsony of refining. And so we got a whole lot of work to do, but even though it's against some free market principles, I don't want us to keep bringing knives to gunfights.
I mean, there's only two regions in the world, if you look at it, that consume a lot more oil and a lot more gas than they produce. China and Europe. Yeah. Okay. Everybody else produces more than they consume. So there was a demand driver here. China didn't have options. They don't have the oil and gas options. Europe does. They won't produce it. Two different reasons. So they made a decision, Belt and Roads and earlier initiatives, to go out and drive the solar, wind, and EV markets. Guess who produces 85% of the world's EVs in the world today? China and Europe. Who needs them? That's fine. And Belt and Roads was brilliant. So that China is doing what it needs to do to have an energy economy because they don't have that resource. They have some other resources. They don't extract those resources in the world. They process them. So through these initiatives, they bought the processing rights for almost 80% on average of all those critical minerals, rare earth elements, and other metals. So it's brilliant. Congratulations, China. Perhaps we feel more secure with our vehicles not having the oil come from the OPEC, and instead all the metals come from China. Maybe that's more secure. How does it make you feel? I don't know. But I think we better darn well understand that's a policy risk and decision that we're making when we do that. And so if you think about the implications of this, and I think we all believe this, but you can tell me, optionality really matters in energy. You have to have options. A portfolio of options is secure. It's also more affordable and reliable, not in some aspects, depending on the time of day and the resource demands and stresses, but the options, just like in a stock portfolio or real estate portfolio, they balance out to reasonable. When you start mandating things, you eliminate options. That's what mandates do. They essentially say, you can't have that option. You can't drive an internal combustion engine here. Or you can, but it's going to be an old dirty one. Brilliant. Okay, that eliminates options. That's not a good idea. Markets don't respond well to lower options, and in energy we need optionality.
Samantha, did you want to weigh in a bit?
Yeah, I just wanted to add just sort of a corollary to what Scott is saying. In the international climate world, people like to give China a really hard time about its coal use. China's still building coal plants. Well, they do it for an energy security reason. They are the world's largest coal producer going away. That's the resource that they really have. They're also the world's, I believe, 5th largest oil producer. You never hear that because, of course, they use all that they produce. Because they're such a massive and a growing economy, they have huge energy needs. And for security reasons, they use what they have.
So let's turn to policy for a bit. We have seen in this country a great instability in policy. Previous administration emphasized the clean and particularly greenhouse gas leg of the three-legged stool. This administration is about energy dominance, actually, not just abundance, but dominance. For energy in particular, because the timescales are so long, fluctuations in policy are really destructive. And how can we get to a more predictable energy policy than what we've historically? Does anybody have a predictable? You look at Europe.
Communism works for some things, Steve.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But
very
consider the
predictable.
cost.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, I don't love that solution, but it's true. Yeah, I mean, I desperately wish that we were having conversations about the energy system like we have up here. Steve and I sat at dinner last night and we laughed about how many things we agree on, because I'm kind of center left and he's kind of center right. And if you locked us in a room, we could come up with some darn good energy policy. Whereas I think there's this idea out there that the Trump administration is fabulous for the energy industry. Whereas I went to world's largest energy conference back in March, and this was before the tariffs were announced, mind you. And the industry was so frustrated because they don't know how to make decisions in such an uncertain environment, and a decision where the policies swing so rapidly. And they're not making decisions on 4-year cycles. They're making decisions on 20-year cycles or more in some cases. And so they would just like some steady policy, punto. And that is a real challenge for them. And so, I mean, what I would really like to see, if we want to be energy dominant, independent, whatever adjective you want to apply to it, the thing that would really achieve that for us is steady policy that we can agree on, that the two parties can agree on, that doesn't change massively every time the occupant of the White House or control of Congress changes. And so the U.S. really should be energy dominant. I mean, look at everything we have here. And yet we're not going to be, because we can't seem to get the policy right.
Scott?
In 2007, this country was importing a lot of oil, and we were starting to import gas. 2007. We now we're the top producer of both in the world. 17 years later, 18 years. That's because of shale.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a revolution, but the confluence of the evolution of technologies. Vertical drilling, horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing, putting those together and then evolving a whole lot of other things, including data and art and intelligence, allowed us to recreate a oil and gas production point higher than it's ever been in the past. I gave a talk a couple years ago in D.C., and it was called Houston, We Have a Problem, because 7 of those 10 big shale basins have either rolled over or plateaued in production now. There's only 3 that are still going up, the Marcellus gas in the east, and it won't without infrastructure. The Haynesville, which has had Twin Peaks and is starting to struggle a little bit, and West Texas, where the oil is, and you produce a lot of associated gas with that. Infrastructure problems there too, the ability to build and take it away. Everything else is plateaued or rolling over. This won't last forever. The resource is there, but to produce that, convert it to a reserve and production is very expensive and very technologically demanding, and it involves a lot of reasonable policy to allow that to happen. So we're about to leave that scene. Start listening carefully to most of the CEOs in that industry today, and they're calling for production peak next year. And guess who's smiling? I mean, in policy sense, I mean, I have to believe that Narendra Modi calls, you know, Xi Jinping, who rings in Vladimir Putin, and they might bring in Mohammed bin Salman every night on Zoom, and they just laugh their asses off at us. Hey, they're still doing it. You know, they're producing all this stuff. It's rolling over. They won't build infrastructure, and they keep bringing in all of our manufactured goods. We got this. You know, I think that call must go on every single night.
What I find...
He asked me to be a little controversial.
Yeah.
How am I doing?
I didn't really have to ask. What I find, and we're going to turn to the audience in a moment, what I find both a tragedy and a mystery is the reticence of many decision makers to speak up about this. The challenges that have become so evident in the energy transition in the last couple years were well known to technically informed people even 2 decades ago. And yet when you talk to the CEOs, the regulatory folks, they're all afraid to speak up and talk about the techno-economic realities. And I think that's what's gotten certainly Europe into trouble, and we're increasingly headed in that direction.
You know what else we've been reticent to talk about, and you did it with your book, and others were as well. Please do this, and email me or text me. Go to the last IPCC report, AR6. Working Group 1, which is the big working group that looks at the technical sides of things and arguably the least political. Chapter 12, table 12.12, okay? And you're gonna, when you get to AR6, write it down, Working Group 1, you can Google this, Chapter 12, you have to expand all sections. There's a little button, expand all sections, because you can't find table 12.12 unless you do that. And there it sits, way down there. These are big reports. And that table summarizes the extreme weather impacts of warming with statistical rigor. And bless the IPCC's heart, some of those climate scientists required that to be in there. Others didn't want it. Because it says, what has emerged from the normal past so far, the normal last 100 years of weather past? What's emerged, actually emerged with statistical high level of confidence? Everything that's white in that table hasn't emerged yet. Go check it out.
34 different climate impact drivers, of which a few show some statistical.
3 have emerged, and maybe 6 more will by 2100 at the RCP 8.5.
Most extreme.
Most
scenario.
extreme.
Yeah.
So this is policy. We are hearing that every event that happens in weather, because we hear about it all the time, is the most extreme. Never unprecedented, never happened. We have to act now. There's no time. This is Thomas Sowell's book. I love Thomas Sowell. The Vision of the Anointed. Go read it again. He lays out the formula for how this happens every single time. It's going to be bad. There's no time to lose. Got to act now. Only governments can solve it. And when it doesn't get solved, well, it would have been worse without us. That's basically the formula.
Samantha, last word, and then we'll go to the audience.
I want to add something onto that, and this is sort of how people in Washington think. So I went to school out here in the Bay Area and moved to Washington 23 years ago, and I was absolutely stunned at how poorly I started out working for Congress, how people there understood how the energy system works, how energy markets work, just engineering facts and science facts in general. Like, we can certainly break man's laws, but breaking God's laws or Mother Nature's laws, depending on your level of religiosity, that ain't happening. It does not work that way. And I hear people, some here in the US, a lot in Europe, say things that just are not going to happen. Oh, you know, we'll make that work. We'll make that process more efficient. Well, actually, you won't, because the thermodynamics isn't your friend. Or somebody, when I first started in Washington, somebody wanted to build more refineries. It was one of those rare times when refiners were making money. So, no, this business is a dog. And we went through all these different permutations of, well, we need them. Well, they're going to build them. No, they're not. And so the level of preconceived notions about how the energy system works, about where profits come from, all of these things, and the underlying science of the energy system is really poorly understood. And that causes problems.
And the climate system as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Really.
Yeah, like I work more on the energy side, you're more on the climate side. But yeah, just the level of technical understanding. And so, not to toot my own horn, but you need more people with science background in these decision making in Congress, in congressional staff, everywhere among where policies are made. Because right now, you have energy security people and you have climate people, and none of them are engineers.
Right. Okay, it's time for you all to get your questions answered or make comments if you agree or disagree. And we'll start over here and then work our way around the room.
Stephen, in your book, you talk about having a red team. One of the things I'd say, I try to look at things and look at the data. I think Condi said you first have to define the problem with data. You had advocated there should be a red team that would actually look at these things. Any hopes that that will happen under the Trump administration?
Yes,
When?
that's all I want to say. All right.
Okay.
Okay. Stay tuned.
Samantha, you said that we need to have steady energy policy in order to move in the right direction. Would you say that California could be an example where energy policy has been fairly consistent over the last few decades? And what would you comment on that and the direction California has gone in?
That's a really good question, because you're right. California, because it has been consistently controlled by the Democratic Party, has had steady policy. And that has certainly enabled some things to take place here that would not otherwise in a swinging policy environment. My one critique of some California policy is that it does sometimes lose the costs and the thermodynamics involved in the situation. Or does, as Scott described, said, oh, we're very clean because we don't do that here. Whereas what it means is those industries aren't here, the products have to come in from somewhere else. And so a lot of it is about, I'm an engineer, system boundaries, and where you draw the boundary around California and what do you think of as being in and out. And so there's a bit of hypocrisy in that, well, the bad things happen somewhere else. So around California, we're clean. But I do think it's true that if you have the policy goal of being as green as possible, California's consistent policy has pushed in that direction.
Solar and wind have been helpful here, and you're very sunny and you got decent wind, so you have a good resource for that. And I love the big grid scale batteries to a point. I'm a geologist, I don't mind mining, but it ain't green. Okay, and never will be. So batteries come from mines, and they're coming from all over the world mines, and they wear out and you have to replace them. So we got to get our heads around what green means again with that. But I like that piece. I don't like you shut down some nuclear, get it off the San Andreas system. That's not a wise place. You know, that's tectonically active, but there are some secure places in California for nuclear. And you've got great oil resources here. Shutting them down just means you're bringing them in, and when Chevron leaves and others are leaving now, the refining's not happening, your governor's going, oh, wow. And so you pay a lot for gasoline, and not one of the top 2 or 3 states for the cost of electricity here. To the consumer, this is regressive, economically regressive. So optionality matters. I like what some things have been done. I don't like some things that have been done. Let's keep those options more robust. Great resource state. Let's lead the world in showing how that works to protect the environment.
Yes, thank you. There's an interesting quote that I sometimes think about. The quote goes along with the sayings of, the right to develop is a right for developing countries. The irony of this quote is, it was championed by Chinese leader Xi Jinping during his Belt and Road Initiative. And the premise, I believe, essentially is once countries finish developing, they then turn their attention to environmental problems. And people can apply the same framework from an international perspective to a more local economy perspective in certain U.S. states. So my main question is there a way to phrase or reframe the dialogue such that environmental regulation isn't some punishing thing that constrains growth?
I'll say something really quick about that. And that is, we talk about the ability to afford, and the previous panel did too, the ability to afford environmental protection. And there's a lot of truth to that your cleanest countries are your richest countries. It is also true that technology is better than it was when the US developed, when Europe developed. And so these countries may not have to go through the rivers on fire and air you can chew era. And so there's got to be a happy balance here somewhere, because we I remember when I would go to LA and you didn't know the mountains were there. And that's just less true anymore. Like air quality in this country has improved significantly. And so we need to find that balance of yes, these companies deserve to develop, and a lot of that development is going to need to happen on fossil fuels, but can it happen on cleaner fossil fuels? Can it use cleaner technologies? That's where I think that's what we need to find.
Hi. I want to pick up on that discussion of industrial policy. So the Biden administration put a bit of money into trying to stand up a domestic supply chain for lithium. And in response, recently, the firm that runs the only lithium mine in the United States said they're kind of going to pass on that because the price is too low. So I'm wondering, what is it going to take to get that industrial policy to work? Will it require price supports? And if it were to require that, would that be desirable?
I'm torn.
Me too.
Because low-priced energy is not a bad thing to me. And if we can't compete on lithium price with other places in the world, okay, maybe that's okay. That's a markets kind of deal in terms of global. I also am looking at the longer term, and the demand for lithium is going to be real, especially if we start putting grid-scale batteries onto our grids. These are big things, and right now lithium is the metal. It's the metal of choice, lithium ion for those. So the future demand is going to grow, and I'd like to see us be able to supply some of that. So what are the investments required in policies to encourage people to take the risk? I don't know. I think policymakers have to think about that. And then there's also the reality that some places, like for example, one of the largest lithium deposits in the country is in spodumene in Maine. Spodumene is a rock that has lithium in it in Maine. Maine will not mine it because they want to be green. And then they're mandating EVs. There's irony here, right? I think there's just a tremendous amount of public education that gets lost. Hey, if you want EVs and you want to play in that world, we got to produce it here some too. Let's mine. John Hickenlooper is a good friend of mine for a long time. He's the only geologist, only scientist in the Senate. Okay. And I kid him all the time. How's the mining going in Colorado, Hick? You firing them back up, and he says something short, 4 letters, and to me, but because we're good friends. It's not going. We're not opening new mines in Colorado. There's plenty of metals there. So this is just the challenge, I think, of what we think we want and what we're willing to do. And policy has to figure out how to bring those things together in sync.
So another general policy principle is that you cannot subsidize to scale.
Yes.
Right?
That's
The
exactly
government
right.
just does not have enough money. $7,500 per electric vehicle subsidy times 14 million 14 million vehicles a year. The math doesn't work. Okay, so it's got to stand on its own, and if it doesn't, it should go elsewhere. Samantha.
Yeah, so I want to comment on things Scott said and then come back around. Something that I think a lot of folks on the very green side forget is that we live in an extractive world. If we want a greener energy system, a different energy system, we're going to have to build it. We're going to need to build things. We're going to need to put things somewhere. Renewables use more land than fossil fuels overall. We're going to need to mine for these minerals. It is true that you need less quantity of them than you would of a fuel. That the amount of lithium in your car battery versus the amount of gasoline it would have run on for its entire lifetime is an important difference. But yeah, we have to understand that, building a system, a boundary around the place you care about, saying I'm only green here, means all the brown goes someplace else. And there's going to be brown because we live in an extractive world. But coming back to the lithium, the biggest question, so I have a friend and colleague who works at the Council on Foreign Relations who looks at this a lot. And the things that she's worried about is Chinese anti-competitive behavior and holding prices down in order to sweat out the competition and make sure that that doesn't come. That's the kind of thing that we may have to deal with policy. But Steve's entirely right. Like, we cannot subsidize these things all. So it depends on what your resource is. Lithium's actually pretty common, so we should be able to do this here. But yeah, it depends on your resource and also on the level of anti-competitive behavior that we may have to combat with policy. So it's not a simple question.
You drill it or you mine it.
Yeah.
Some of it you grow, but that's not a whole lot.
Yeah, no,
10%.
it's got to come from somewhere.
I'm Ken Judd, Senior Fellow here. We love to bash China, and talking about cornering the market on solar was an example of that. But my impression is that they also improved the technology. And now, so there's a lot of R&D aspects to it, and R&D is something we don't leave to the market. I think we need to make a distinction between industrial policy used to basically control markets versus R&D. And it's hard to make the distinction. Nuclear power in this country, for example, was certainly not invented by markets. There's a lot of government subsidy of it. So I think we need to think about technology and how to improve it, not so much market share.
Yeah, I didn't mean to bash China. I thought I said that it was brilliant. They saw their future and they've acted on it. I think they did that brilliantly and effectively. So that's not a bash at all. I completely agree that R&D, and let's call it basic R&D, even before, to me, TRLs, whatever you want, technology readiness levels, whatever you want to call them. I don't like what this administration is doing, tearing a lot of the research investment down. I don't think it makes any sense at all. Okay. Now, some of it was ineffective. Okay, we'll deal with that, but let's not tear down the house. In the meantime, to get that built back again isn't going to happen overnight. So R&D is one of the most effective things our nation has done and can continue to do. And nuclear, a good example. Oil and gas, a great example. A lot of private investment as well as public investment in that. The federal government was investing in shale research in the 70s. Shale research. So these are the right partnerships to think about here. But then not going and picking company winners and making $3 billion loans to failing companies. This kind of gets into the program that you had to deal with for a while as undersecretary. Yeah, okay, well, what are the governments doing picking winners with all of our money like that? That's a market thing. Let the markets figure that piece out.
Samantha.
Yeah, I want to add a little bit to that. And let's sort of take a second and think about what the U.S. is good at. And we're sitting at Stanford, for Pete's sake. Obviously, we're very good at research and development, and cutting that is bananas. That's part of what makes our country really good. Another thing that makes this country a fantastic place to do business is our capital markets. Everything from the VCs who are up the road to angel investors, all the way through private equity and all the different ways that you can start and grow a business here. We're great at that. And I spent some time talking to I spent a lot of time in Europe. I spent a lot of time talking to economists over there, and they're jealous. They do not have that fully developed ecosystem from soup to nuts to get a new technology to market. And so that's a wonderful problem to be in here. And anything we do that puts a spanner in that works is a terrible idea. I'm going to defend the program that Scott's talking about for just a second, though. Because when you think about taking a business from somebody's lab bench to a pilot plant to a commercial plant, those two leaps that I just described are big leaps. They're big leaps in terms of money and in terms of risk. And it can be quite difficult to get those funded. And that is an area where I do think there is a place for the government to help out, particularly when you're talking about sort of building first-of-a-kind technology. Every bank wants to fund the third one. Once you've proven this technology works, they're on it like white on rice. But getting that first one done can be really difficult. And I do think that's an area where the government can be helpful. Not necessarily picking winners and losers, but looking at promising technologies and saying the valley of death is wide for this technology, but we think it's got some promise. That's why Tesla survived. And if you look at the Loan Program Office during the Obama administration, they lost some. Solyndra was a political nightmare. On the other hand, that office made money.
Yes.
Which I think was very, I think the politics behind that were poorly handled. And honestly, if they were investing so conservatively that they never lost a company, then they weren't being risky enough. Because they didn't have a profit motive. All they had to do was break even, and they had the overall goal for our country's betterment of helping technologies over the valley of death. So I think there's a role there, and I like it.
Since we have found a topic where we could have a meaningful disagreement, Unfortunately, I'm getting the hook from the organizers. But both of you will be around at least
Oh, yeah,
for a
all
couple
day.
hours for individual conversations.
Happy to.
Thank you both for a really interesting dialogue, and thanks everybody
Well, thanks
for
for
listening.
leading us.